October 1912, Tarzan storms onto the page, a white king of the African jungle, just as Europe is carving up nearly an entire continent. The official story says he is pure fiction, a wild myth with no real roots. But the jungle mastery he displays was real, borrowed from African hunters and trackers Europe depended on to survive. So why did history erase them and let Tarzan take the throne? Understanding that theft is not just about the past, it is about who gets to be a hero, even now. Edgar Rice Burroughs sat in Chicago in the early 1910s, never having set foot on African soil, yet he was about to launch a story that would echo across continents. In October 1912, the first installment of Tarzan of the Apes appeared in All Story magazine. The cover promised readers an untamed Africa, danger, adventure, a white man who could out-hunt lions and outsmart every living thing in the jungle. Within months, Tarzan became a sensation. By 1914, the story was published as a book, and Burroughs' Wild Orphan had already started his climb from pulp pages to global icon. Burroughs drew from a stew of popular adventure tales, explorer accounts, and the Colonial press. He never claimed expertise, he did not need it. The world he wrote for was hungry for stories about Africa as a place to be conquered, mapped, and ruled. The Tarzan that leapt from his typewriter was not just a man raised by apes. He was presented as a white English lord, the supposed natural master of a land he had never seen. Burroughs loaded the character with abilities that seemed supernatural to his readers, tracking animals through dense forest, reading the language of birds, moving unseen through the green. These were not mere flourishes. These were skills Burroughs had read about in reports from African expeditions, travelogues, and missionary letters. But on the page, they became the birthright of a white man, not the inheritance of the people who had lived those forests for generations. The timing of Tarzan's arrival was no accident. 1912 sat at the crossroads of empire. Across Africa, European powers were locking down borders, squeezing out rubber, ivory, and gold, and crushing resistance with bullets and bureaucracy. The Congo had just begun to emerge from the nightmare of Leopold's personal rule, but forced labor and violence still ran through daily life. British flags flew over Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. French soldiers marched across the Sahel. German colonial officers carved out new territories. The press back in Europe and America filled their pages with stories of white explorers, wild jungles, and heroic conquest. Tarzan fit right in, a fictional hero who could reassure anxious readers that even in the heart of Africa, a white man could not just survive, but reign. Burroughs' creation was more than pulp entertainment. It functioned as a blueprint for how the West wanted to see itself: strong, central, unchallenged, even in places where its power was built on borrowed skill. The legend started here, in a magazine story published in October 1912, but the roots stretched further into real lives, real knowledge, and real erasure. By the late 1800s, European flags blanketed the African continent. Belgium, Britain, France, and Germany were in a race to carve up land, lay claim to rivers, and drain the earth of anything valuable: rubber, gold, ivory, and people. The Congo Free State, run as King Leopold II's personal property from 1885 to 1908, became infamous for forced labor and violence so extreme that even other colonial powers called it out. Yet even after international outrage forced Leopold to hand over control, the brutality barely slowed. British administrators set up shop in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. French soldiers drew new maps across West Africa and the Sahel. German officers grabbed whatever territory they could in Cameroon and Tanganyika. Every new border was a line drawn for profit, not for people. Back in Europe, newspapers and magazines churned out stories to match the appetite of empire. The public devoured tales of daring white explorers, wild jungles, and heroic conquest. These were not just adventure stories, they were advertisements for empire itself. The message was clear. Africa was a place of danger and mystery, waiting to be tamed by the right kind of man. The press, publishers, and pulp magazines worked hand in glove with the colonial machine. They painted Africa as both a threat and a prize, and the European as the natural ruler of it all. This was the climate into which Tarzan landed. The timing was not random. In 1912, While colonial officers were still writing reports about uprisings and unrest in the Congo or Nigeria, Western readers were being fed a steady diet of stories where the jungle was wild, Africans were background noise, and the white hero always found his way to the top. Tarzan was not just a character, he was a comfort. He told anxious Europeans that no matter what the headlines said about resistance or rebellion, the empire's grip was still firm. Even in the most hostile environment, a white man could become king. The popularity of Tarzan rode this wave. Adventure magazines, serialized novels, and later films all reinforced the idea that European power in Africa was natural, even heroic. The real function of these stories was not just entertainment, they reassured people back home that colonial rule was justified, that the world made sense with Europe at the center. The myth of Tarzan was a kind of public relations, smoothing over the violence and theft of empire with the fantasy of white mastery. While real Africans were being forced to work, displaced from their lands, or written out of their own histories, the West was busy cheering for a jungle king who looked nothing like them. The press did not just report on empire, it made sure the story felt right, even when the facts were ugly. Deep in the Ituri forest, long before outsiders ever dreamed up stories of jungle kings, the Mbuti people were tracking life and death through the green. Their skill was not myth or rumor, it was survival, sharpened over centuries. A Mbuti tracker could kneel beside a patch of pressed grass and read it like a diary. Which animal passed, how many, whether it was healthy or limping, even how long ago it moved through. Claw marks on a tree were not just scratches. They told a story of hunger, movement, and territory. Every snapped twig, every shift in the dirt, every change in the air meant something to those who knew how to listen. But it was not just the ground that spoke. Mbuti hunters learned to read the forest soundtrack. Birds did not just sing for music, their calls changed when danger moved. A sudden silence, a sharp warning note, a ripple of agitation traveling tree to tree, these were alarms that no European compass could pick up. The forest itself was a living map, and the Mbuti moved through it with a confidence that left colonial officers stumbling in their wake. The record is there, if you know where to look. In 1906, a Royal Geographical Society expedition leader wrote, "Without our native tracker, we would have been lost within a day. His ability to read the forest, to understand where the animals had passed and what weather was approaching, surpassed anything we had learned in London." That is not a compliment. That is an admission of dependence. The men who arrived with rifles and maps found themselves helpless without local expertise. They might have been armed, but they were blind. The Mbuti, barefoot and unhurried, were the only reason those expeditions made it out alive. When European explorers described these skills in their journals, the language was always careful, always hedged. Uncanny ability, native instinct, remarkable intuition, they wrote, as if what they witnessed was magic, not mastery. But there was nothing mystical about it. The Mbuti learned from elders, practiced from childhood, and carried knowledge in their bodies and memories. Tracking was not a party trick. It was a science, passed down in quiet lessons and daily tests. To see it in action, picture a line of hunters moving through thick undergrowth, pausing to touch a claw mark, listening as the birds fall silent. One gestures, and the group shifts course, no words, just a shared understanding of what the forest is saying. They are not chasing adventure for a storybook. They are finding food, avoiding danger, and keeping each other alive. This is the real blueprint, the one that got stripped for parts and pasted onto a character who never set foot in Africa. The proof sits in the archives, in the lines written by men who depended on what they could never truly grasp. The forest belonged to the Mbuti, not because they claimed it, but because they understood it. Every step, every sound, every sign was a conversation. That is the truth behind the legend, a truth that survived in the margins of colonial journals, waiting for someone to read it for what it really says. In the deep green of the Ituri forest, knowledge was not just a man's game. Women moved through the bush with a confidence that came from generations of practice, carrying baskets instead of spears, but holding a different kind of power. At dusk, when the forest shadows stretched long and the air turned cool, women set out to gather what their families needed. Some walked barefoot, a knife strapped to the hip, a woven basket balanced on the head, their steps sure even when the path vanished under tangled roots and leaves. They knew which tubers hid beneath the soil, which fruits ripened high in the branches, which mushrooms would nourish and which would sicken. Night did not scare them. It was a friend, a cover, the time when certain plants revealed their secrets. Healers too worked in the quiet, away from the noise of the hunt. In villages scattered through the forest, women kept the memory of plants alive. They could spot a sap-bleeding tree with just a glance, scrape the bark, and collect the sticky resin that slowed bleeding faster than anything in a colonial first aid kit. Ethnographers would later record the use of these hemostatic saps, sometimes from the bark of the alcornia or the leaves of the nubuldia tree, applied to wounds from machete or thorn, a skill passed mother to daughter. This was not folklore. It was practical science, tested every day and trusted with lives on the line. Some nights, a woman would slip into the bush alone, basket in hand, knowing exactly where to find a bitter root that eased childbirth or a vine whose crushed leaves soothed fever. She moved quietly, listening for the calls of nocturnal birds, reading the rustle of leaves for signs of snakes or small mammals. The forest at night was alive with dangers, but it was also a pharmacy, a pantry, and a place of work. The colonial records barely mention these routines, but oral histories hold them close. In many communities, this knowledge moved through the women's line. Grandmothers taught granddaughters which leaf to chew for a toothache, which flower to boil for cough, which seed to grind for a stubborn fever. Some plants were kept secret, used only by those trusted with healing or ritual work. Others were shared in songs, stories, or quiet instruction around the fire. When outsiders arrived with notebooks and cameras, they often missed the point. The real mastery was happening in the margins, in the hands of women who could walk out at midnight and come back with medicine, food, and answers. Tarzan's world had no space for these women. His jungle was a stage for male heroics, for brute strength and solitary adventure. But the real forests of Central and West Africa held a different truth. Survival depended on a network of knowledge, much of it carried by women, healers, foragers, mothers, and grandmothers. Their work was not loud or showy, but it was essential, and it kept whole communities alive long before and long after any outsider wrote a word about the jungle. Reflection theft is the name for what happened when colonial powers watched African mastery, took it, and then held up a mirror that showed only their own face. Philosopher Akili Mbembe puts it this way: colonialism is not just the occupation of land, but the occupation of the imagination. That is the mechanism. It is not just about stealing resources, it is about stealing the story of who is capable, who is expert, who is human. In the case of Tarzan, the process was surgical. First, real African knowledge, tracking, healing, surviving, was stripped from the people who lived it. Then that knowledge was reframed as instinct or animal nature, never as intellect or science. Finally, it was recast in the body of a white hero so the world could cheer for the skills while forgetting the source. Reflection. Theft means you do not just lose credit, you lose the chance to even see yourself as the original. The story gets rewritten until the reflection in the glass is no longer yours. Mbembe's words make it plain. When your legends are recast, your place in the world shrinks. That is why these patterns matter. They show how ideology gets built, not just on what is taken, but on what is erased from memory and then sold back as someone else's triumph. This isn't just a Tarzan problem, it's a pattern that shows up everywhere you look. Take music. In 1953, Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog, her voice raw, her delivery fierce. 3 years later, Elvis Presley cut his own version. Same song, same bones, but this time it hit #1 and made Elvis a star. The world called him the king of rock and roll, while Big Mama's name faded into the background. The money, the headlines, the credit, all shifted from the black originator to the white performer. In technology, the pattern repeats. James West, a black inventor at Bell Labs, co-created the Electret microphone in 1964. That invention made possible everything from telephones to hearing aids. Nearly 90% of microphones today use his design. Yet for decades, West's name was buried while companies cashed in. The innovation traveled, but its creator was left in the shadows. Even in the kitchen, the story stays the same. Dishes like gumbo and collard greens, born from Black ingenuity and survival, now show up in trendy restaurants as elevated Southern or soul-inspired cuisine. The chefs getting press and awards rarely look like the grandmothers who perfected those recipes. The food is praised, the roots ignored. It's not coincidence. It's a system that takes Black creation, repackages it, and hands the spotlight to someone else. Tarzan is just one headline in a much bigger story. Every time you see Tarzan swinging through the trees, let your mind fill in the real faces behind the myth. Picture the Mbutai tracker, the healer in the forest, the warrior who moved unseen. That is the autocorrect. Do not let the story stop at the white silhouette. See the source, name the skill, remember who paid the price for erasure. If you want to go deeper, start with the annotated edition of Tarzan of the Apes. Read it with the introduction by scholars who break down the colonial blueprint, not just the plot. Visit the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, Belgium. Their archives hold expedition journals, maps, and records that show the real expertise behind the so-called adventure. For living knowledge, look up the Okapi Conservation Project, a non-governmental organization working with Mbuti communities in the Ituri Forest. They support oral history projects and forest protection, real-world work to keep these stories alive. You have the power to reframe the myth every time you encounter it. Share the sources, challenge the erasure, support the community still holding the knowledge. That is how you reclaim what was stolen. One story, one correction, one action at a time. Today, stories still shape who we see as heroes and who gets erased. As media continues to recycle old myths, erasure becomes silent consent. Recognizing whose skills, legends, and mastery built these icons is not just about history, it is about reclaiming dignity now. The real Jungle Kings never vanished, they were just hidden behind someone else's spotlight. Drop your thoughts below and keep the conversation going.